For more on the anniversary of Egypt's uprising, we go to Brian Dodley in Washington, D.C. He's the director of the Human Rights Defenders Program at Human Rights First. Brian, thanks so much for joining us. From a human rights perspective, has the 2011 revolution left Egyptians worse off than under Hosni Mubarak?
I don't think there's any doubt, really, that however you measure it, things are worse now than they were 5 years and a day ago. The political space to operate is much narrower. It's virtually non-existent now. During the last years of Mubarak, particularly, there was what now seems like a real, albeit narrow, opportunity for people to voice peaceful dissent. There were red lines, of course, which were fairly strictly drawn, but within those, it was possible to criticize certain aspects of the government. But really, those have almost gone completely now. People who were active five and just over years ago in terms of speaking out to the media or even trying to hold protests have now been largely driven either overseas or underground or into jails. It's a much bleaker prospect now, a much bleaker situation now than it was 5 years ago. I was in Cairo, came back last week and spoke to people who a few years ago, 5 years ago, would have been happy to be seen speaking to an international NGO like ours, and now they're very scared about being seen.
It is tragic. Brian, what would need to happen to vindicate the leaders of the uprising 5 years ago?
Fairly seismic shift now at this stage in Egyptian politics. Now the US and the international community can't really decide what happens in Egypt. That's down to Egyptians, but what it can do is play its cards very differently from the way it has over the last few years. It's really been far too quick to support whatever autocratic regime has been in power, and there's been a succession of them since the Mubarak regime fell, and of course for the 30 years before that, while Mubarak was in power. People warned fairly ominously of another upheaval. The activists, the human rights people I spoke to there last week, several of them warned of this, but not really with any optimism. I mean, it was with great foreboding that they predicted that the Sisi regime is likely not to last until the next presidential election in a couple of years. And that something dramatic and perhaps even worse is likely to take its place. There's talk of how readily available guns are now, for instance, compared to 5 years ago. It's possible to buy guns fairly easily now in Egypt, and the sense of anger is growing, as far as I could tell. And I think there's even less sense of direction about what would happen after the regime falls, as there was 5 years ago. And that, of course, was one of the big failings of 2011, that the protesters were so focused on dragging down the regime that when they did, there was a bit of a what should we do now?
Yeah.
I think that would be even more pronounced were there to be another popular revolt, because you know, those pieces which could conceivably have put together a working democratic government have now been really, as I say, driven underground or out of the country.
Okay, Brian, in spite of the grave violations of human rights that organizations like yours can point out, the United States and Egypt seem to be building an ever stronger relationship. Tell us how detrimental that is to your cause.
Well, it depends what you mean by building an ever stronger relationship. The United States government and the Egyptian government, I think, are mutually benefiting from the great military aid that goes from the US to Egypt. But in terms of the wider relationship, for instance, between America beyond its government and Egypt beyond its government, I think that relationship is it's deteriorated very fast. I mean, the level of anti-Americanism, which was never low in the first place, is now increased. The sense of disappointment and letdown that many Egyptians have with the US and Europe too, in letting them down, is booming. So that, you know, the US has trapped itself back in this corner, which it was in for 30 years before 2011, where it decided that its least worst option was to back the strong man in power, just back the dictatorship. But this has turned out time and time and time after again to be so short-sighted. Bad for Egypt, and in fact bad for the US too, because it ends up then being associated with, and quite rightly, blamed for propping up a violent dictatorship. It did it under Mubarak, it did it under Morsi, and now it's doing it under Sisi. So
Okay.
that relationship looks strong, but actually it's very, very brittle and very weak.
Okay, Brian Dodley, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight.